Welcome to the Code with Jason meetup. Today will be a mentoring session with my new friend Erin. Erin, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
We got a pretty good attendance today. We got Ross from Vermont, right?
Yep.
And then David from Kenya. And then we have it changed from Tiffany to John. So I'm not sure who is with us.
Yeah, apologies. It was my wife's account. But yeah, this is John.
Oh, it's okay. Where are you located, John?
Tampa, Florida.
Tampa, Florida. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so today we're talking with Erin, who is with us via my free mentorship program. And by the way, dear viewer, if you're interested in my mentorship program, you can go to codewithjason.com and you can find some information there. But Erin, I'm curious to get to know you a little bit. First of all, where are you located? What's your life story? All that stuff.
So I'm currently located in Lake Leelanau, Michigan. It is a little town north of Traverse City. Not quite the UP, just a little bit below that. Really pretty area in Michigan, originally from Chicago. And I'm a career switcher. I most recently worked for Planet Argon, was laid off a little while ago. In the job hunt right now, Ruby for Rails dev and doing a little bit of Ruby for Good. It was what we'll be doing is where before I worked for Planet Argon, kind of where I started to work on production applications and really understand what it was like to be a developer.
Awesome. And by the way, if anybody finds this interesting, Lake Leelanau, or at least Traverse City, where Erin lives, is about a 2.5 hour drive from my house. I just get on the freeway north and he's up in that direction. So hopefully we can get together in person sometime. But I'm curious, you said you're a career switcher. Can you tell us a little bit about your previous career or careers?
Yeah, so it all kind of is encompassed under outdoor recreation. Everything from working for a group called the National Outdoor Leadership School in Wyoming, where I have led month-long backpacking trips, had to become an EMT in order to be certified to take out those trips. Taught wilderness medicine, it sounds really fancy. It's more like really glorified first aid that you can do without a ton of resources around you. Worked at university and took out students there and taught recreation admin trips or courses and took out trips while I was there out of Chicago, and was fortunate enough to get to take a bunch of trips internationally and do some cool, interesting, different things in areas like Costa Rica, a little area of Panama called Cunayala. So just being able to backpack and hike and climb and take people to places, and now coding.
Nice. And how'd you end up in Lake Leelanau?
My partner, she is from this area, and we were doing long distance for a bunch of years, and we made a decision that if we were going to get married, Lake Leelanau is a much better place long term to be than Chicago. We have 2 kids, and it's a great area to raise children, and you can hike and bike and do lots of outdoor activities. You have to like living in the outdoors to be out here.
Yeah. Yeah. How old are your kids?
5 and 7.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of really nice outdoor stuff to do up there. I really enjoy it there. Okay. I guess we can go ahead and get started. Erin, you had sent me a link before this. Can you tell us a little bit about the project you were wanting to have us work on?
Sure. So the project is called Pet Rescue. If anybody's interested, you can check out Ruby for Good. There are a series of different projects on there. If folks don't know what Ruby for Good is, and I don't want to plug them too much here, as long as it's appropriate, a bunch of volunteers get together in different capacities and build applications for not-for-profits that need software resources. So the project that we're going to be working on today is called Pet Rescue. It's an application that eventually Ruby for Good will give away to adoption agencies for pets. We're working our way to MVP right now, so it's very early stages still. And we'll be working on a model, either change or redo. We started at one point with creating a model, and now we're going to have to make some shifts to it. So that's what we'll be working on today.
Okay, great. And I forgot to ask, maybe you maybe you said, but I didn't catch it. How long have you been programming?
Including the volunteer, about 3.5 years.
Okay. And then like purely professionally?
2 years, 2.5 years, two and change professionally at Planet Argon.
Okay. And is there anything specific you're hoping to learn, that kind of thing?
So when we had our meeting last night, I ended my portion of it. I got my tests passing. I was ready to clean up this PR. There was some comments left in there, and then last night, Ben, who I think you may know,
Yeah.
who's the leader of the project, made some additional changes to it. My inclination is to start from scratch and zap everything, and just start from zero and redo it. But also, he had wrote on the ticket to try to rename stuff and not go from scratch. So the room is filled with more experience. So I had a plan to maybe go that route. And I was just wondering for feedback on what folks think about zapping it and starting from zero, or going through the whole process of trying to rename and then dealing with the potential errors and tests and so forth and so on. So that's what I was hoping to go through today.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me change my sharing options so you're able to share your screen. And then whenever you're ready, you can feel free to share your screen and we can take a look.
What would you like to start with, the ticket itself or
Yeah, how about that?
okay, give me 1 second and let me
Mhm.
pull that up. Bear with me.
Yeah, no problem.
That isn't what we want. Okay, here we go. Let me pull this up here. Let's do. There we go. So initially, we started out with creating, if I get this correct, I believe it was an adopter account. I'd have to go through the code and double check this. It went through a couple iterations and ended on a polymorphic relationship. And now I believe that we are changing this to rename the adopter account to adopter foster account, as well as its corresponding table and code references. So the acceptance criteria down here is renaming the adopter account table and changing it to this. Rename the model, and then keep the same model associations. Okay, so we're not getting that tricky with it, but update the relationships belong to user. User has one adopter foster account, and then update the code with code references of adopter. And then we ran into some issues with some relationships with getting our test passing yesterday, mainly with FactoryBot and getting the correct relationships inside of FactoryBot, but we got that working last night. So now we're gonna have to make these changes. Does that sound like something worth tackling here?
For all I know, yeah. I'm not sure what I'm looking at yet, but we'll get into that, I guess.
Okay,
Okay. So I personally am maybe missing context.
okay.
To me, these acceptance criteria speak in terms of low-level technical details, and for all I know, that's totally appropriate. But for me personally, I don't understand the broader context and why these changes are being made.
Okay. I not really certain either. I would have to scroll through my Slack conversations to see why they made the decisions they did to change it as to this instead of it. And I'm guessing that it has to do with adopter foster account, maybe a better title for this relationship, for this model in this table versus just adopter accounts. We can work on something else. If it's just as simple as changing a name, maybe I can figure that out on my own. And you'd rather work on something else, but that's what I think it just has to do with, we're still clarifying and fleshing out titles of tables and how this works within the models.
Okay. And then for context of like the work situation, how, because this is a bit different from like a commercial project where full-time developers are working on it.
Yep.
Can you give me a feel for how the workflow goes? Like, do issues get created without any specific person in mind, and then people just grab them? Or like, was this one, for example, specifically created for you, or how does that work?
Sure. So at any point, anybody can come in and give a go to any single issue ticket that they have within a project. They may get stumped and they may pass it on to somebody else, or they may let folks know, hey, I want to work on something that's front end or back end or more challenging. So short answer is at any point, anybody can grab a ticket and they can work on it. And then people like Ben, who are the project manager, he can make changes as time goes on. There's another gentleman, Ken, who is working on it. So yeah, just about anybody can grab a ticket, and they may make decisions to change what's happening at any point.
Okay. One of the biggest, most common problems I see in dev teams is that the work that's assigned to the developers is not really shovel ready. It's kind of half baked. Um, and what, you know, I don't want to pick on our friend Ben. So no offense, Ben, about anything I'm about to say, if you happen to be watching. Um, but there's design and there's implementation, and a lot of times assignments will be given to developers even though they're not fully designed, and they're saying, here, I want you to not only do this work but also somehow figure out what work you need to do in addition to doing the work. um and that makes things a lot harder. And again, that's a really common problem that I see. um a piece of work is communicated and the developer gets it, and the problem is compounded by a certain perception of competence, for lack of a better way to put it. When I was a kid, I thought the world was run by competent adults, and now I realize that it's absolutely not. And so, like, a lot of times when people enter their dev careers, they'll get a job and they'll get assigned some work, and they kind of make an assumption that the person who's assigning them the work is doing an appropriate, competent job of assigning that work, and they take their assignment as gospel. Um, when somebody like me who's been in the industry for many years, when I look at an assignment, I'm actually starting with the default assumption that it is corrupt and not actually ready for me to work on. And so I'm going to scrutinize it and question it and work with the person who's assigning me the work to figure out how to make it right. So
And can I add some context to that
yeah,
as
yeah,
well?
go ahead.
And also, and this falls on me, not it's just I think it's the nature of open source work. I'm not at every meeting, and I don't see the relationships, and I don't work on it with the consistency that you do a project that you're assigned to in the workplace, where it's day in, day out. So there's sometimes conversations that happen over here, or there's a conversation that happens at a meeting that I'm not at, and I don't participate in that conversation, and it doesn't, my knowledge when I'm working on this ticket doesn't reflect everything that was shared in, let's say, last week, Tuesday's meeting. So that complexity becomes a little bit more challenging because Ben doesn't know what I don't know, versus in a workplace setting where oftentimes the expectation is you're there, you're at the meeting, you have the context of what everyone else is working at and how that application might be changing. So I feel like sometimes that is some of the challenge of with open source projects like this, where you can dip in and dip out, is the vision of it organically changes. And if I'm not there for all of that, I don't really see that change happening. And it becomes part of like the known set of knowledge that the ownership team has.
Yeah, yeah, that makes things even tougher. Um, so there's a monologue that I'm trying to suppress, but I think I'm just gonna give this monologue anyway, and I'll try to make it concise. So I was thinking recently about, like, if a programmer if you were to make an analogy between like an automotive plant and an engineering organization, what role would a programmer fit into? And the
Say that
obvious
again.
answer, oh yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead. No,
So
go ahead. Sorry.
if you were to make an analogy between an auto plant and an engineering organization, um, what role would the programmers fall in? Like, would they be the manager, the factory worker, somebody else? Do you have a thought on that, Erin?
Yeah, I think we fall somewhere in between a line worker and a designer. I think it depends on the day and the ticket and the issue that you're dealing with. But there's days where you get assigned a task and it's pretty easy to line work and go through it. And then there's other times where you get assigned a ticket and you may have insight into a section of that application, and then the design portion of it, the architect portion of you has to start asking questions about how does my assigned ticket relate to the overall vehicle, to use your analogy,
Yeah.
and say, I can't, this isn't the best for me to, I've done this, this part shouldn't go here, and I know this based on the overall engine. That's the design architect part I think that we fall into as developers.
Okay. And design of, this might seem like a dumb question, but design of what exactly?
Just depends on what you're working on. It could be, if you're assigned a front end ticket, you can ask yourself whether this, am I using this particular type of CSS on this button the particular way, like it doesn't seem conducive to this entire application. In this case, are the models designed in a way that best benefit the relationships of the overall database? It just depends. For me, ticket to ticket is what I would say.
Okay. So maybe, analogously, like the body of the car, the engine of the car, something like
Sure.
that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
You're serving as the automotive engineer.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. I'm curious if anybody else has any thoughts to add. Ross, do you have any thoughts?
It's an interesting question because the question is whether the car is the product or whether the factory is the product. Because if the car is the product, then I don't love the analogy because I think software is more artistic of a of you know of a work and job than just putting pieces together on a car. Even if you've done the same thing, created a button a million times, every application is different. So I never would go with somebody being a lineman as an engineer. It's more like a manager within the factory if you're going with the car as the product.
Yeah. What if the factory
So
is the product?
the factory is the product, then most likely then it's like a hierarchy. Uh there are a couple of different this is so my original background was chemical engineering, and I also
Mhm.
have master's level work in mechanical engineering, so I
Okay.
understand the area a little bit. And it
Okay.
would end up being that the analogy is there are mechanical engineers that will design the machines that assemble pieces of the car, and that would be what I would consider a software engineer. But
Mhm.
then there are people that work on the whole layout of the factory and the
Mhm.
workflow of the factory, and that gets into the senior engineer and the architect's level because they're working on, hey, you know we need to create a door. We also need to create the engine. Well, we're going to assign engineers to create the processes that make those, but we have to then tie them together somehow. And that's where the senior level, the architect thinking is going to kind of put these pieces together. And then it's gets down to like the design and stuff of the car comes down to product managers and designers, I would think, if I want to go with that analogy.
Yeah. Okay. So, Aaron, this conversation has taken a serious philosophical turn, but I swear it's all relevant.
No,
Um,
I'm digging it. I'm digging it.
yeah. So, I was writing this thing. I abandoned this piece of writing because I was calling it something about like it was called "How to Be a Better Engineering Leader" or something like that, and I decided it was just too vague of an idea. But in it, I wrote about this and I started to write about this analogy. And earlier, I would have said that a programmer is somebody who builds the cars in the factory, because earlier maybe I didn't think about it very much. But then once I was forced to actually like deeply think about it and reconcile this with that in the analogy, I realized that the programmers are the people who design the machinery of the factory, or depending on how far you want to take the analogy, you know, designing the factory itself and all that. But they're not the people who design the product that the factory produces. They're the people who design the factory itself, which I think is really interesting. And there's some like counterintuitive realizations I came to. It's like, okay, if the programmers are the people who design the machinery that makes the cars, what does a car correspond to in this analogy?
Best guess in my idea, the car is the output of the factory. So for us, it would be the output of any application that we're dealing with, the data that comes out from the factory that we're producing, from the application we're producing.
That's pretty close. Ross, do you
Yeah.
have any
I
thoughts?
mean, I would have said the data, or at least, I mean, in some cases, I almost want to say something like the UX could be construed as it. Yeah.
Well, here's my answer, and
Okay,
I'm
go ahead.
open to being shown wrong. But what I arrived at is that an individual car is analogous to an individual page load.
Hmm.
So it's sort of a strange kind of factory. Um, Instead of an automotive factory where you just produce cars, you know, you make however many of them a day or whatever, this is an on-demand factory, and it makes, you know, maybe thousands of different kinds of products. And when a customer orders a product, that particular product is just manufactured on the spot, and you know it's obviously manufactured but it makes sense if you think about it, because if the programmer is the person who designs the factory machinery, um, then when the factory produces a product, that means the machinery is being run, and the output of the machinery being run is, you know, the response from an HTTP request.
Yeah. I I think you're onto something. And when you're explaining it like that, I was thinking along the lines of a user story, maybe,
Hmm.
because you're completing something. And a user story can be vague in, agile terms. It could be as simple as user logs on, user signs up, or it can be as simple as, user submits a simple form or clicks a button. And I feel like a page load is good. I think it makes sense. It's very specific to SaaS develop, or not SaaS development, but web development then at that point. Whereas you could kind of generalize it a little bit more for engineering with like a user story or something that is fully encompassed with something a user can do.
Hmm. Let's think of a different kind of program that's not a web application. Let's see. I'm trying to think of something like wildly different. I don't know, like the software that controls a here we go. Um the software or firmware or whatever that controls this remote for my mini split in my office. Um I think the individual product would be like, when I let's see here, what can I do with this thing? Um when I don't know, when I press the mode button on this thing, then something happens. Presumably, oh, what did I just do? Okay, who knows what's going to happen to my climate in my office now that I press that. Um, but when I press that button, some code executes, and some result happens. Um, and I would posit or whatever that me pressing that button and the code executing is like the machinery of the factory manufacturing a product, and then the output or result of that code run is analogous to the product that's being manufactured.
Yeah. So like the car is the change in climate or the response from the split.
Yeah, again, it's a very strange kind of factory that makes a bazillion kinds of products, but I think the strangeness of the factory doesn't invalidate the way the analogy fits.
Yeah. I think that I think you're very onto something. I've worked with a lot of MBA types that try and treat agile development and Scrum as a developers are a line worker, and
Mhm.
the individual pieces of work are widgets, so to speak, that everybody has experience with, and you're able to estimate very well if you break it
Mhm.
down small enough and you say, hey, you know, if I break this down all the way down to a button, I should be able to, with estimation points, say 1, 2, or 3, and connect that and then track a velocity. But then you notice that those errors can pile up, and long-term estimation is very difficult, if not impossible. I
Mhm.
love debating people about this, so I won't go too
Yeah.
deep into it. But estimation is one of the hardest things to do. And for many MBA types that come into software and don't have the experience, I'm not going to say all of them think this way, but many of them have trouble connecting with the idea that software can take a varied amounts of time. One time changing a color on a button can take 5 minutes, and one time it can take hours or days, depending on how it is. And I'm not going to go into it, but my favorite analogy with this is getting work done on your house, because a lot of people have had that where they get an estimate for a bathroom, a new bathroom, and the estimate is $20,000, and they open up the bathroom and suddenly it's $30,000, and the estimate is exploded. And the reason being, well, most bathrooms cost 20,000, but we can't see inside the walls until we start working and we open up the walls, and then we get better at estimating and it will change the estimate. But that's the nature of the beast, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I appreciate that as far as, and not to get too sidetracked off of your initial point, Jason, but Ross, to bring it back to the car analogy, it's like something as simple as that button changing colors and changing the spark plug, right? Like, to bring it back to cars, it's like, you look at one type of car and you're like, oh, it took me an hour and a half to change the spark plugs on this car. You open up the engine on a Porsche and you're like, oh, the engine isn't even in the front of the car. You open up, you start getting into making changes in an application, a version of a Rails application that is multiple years older. Well, before I can even begin to do these things, I have all these updates I have to make. So it's like that estimation and that car analogy. I appreciate that, because changing the spark plugs, depending on the situation, working on changing the color of a button can be dramatically different depending upon the overall structure around it.
Yeah, and remember that the programmer isn't the programmer isn't the person building the car
Yeah.
or even modifying the physical car. They're the person changing the design of the machinery that manufactures the car.
Mm.
And so it's like, yeah, take this existing car design and we want to make a variant of the design where the wheelbase is longer. And that has all sorts of other implications. It's like not only, and so uh, I think, this analogy that we've come up with, it's not very obvious or intuitive. And so one can see how easy it is to miss it. And so managers will assign work to a developer and they think that they're saying make a change to this car, but what they're really saying is make a change to the design of the machinery that manufactures this car, and that's a whole different story. Um, I was gonna say another thing, but I forgot what it was. I'm going to pause there in case anybody else has any comments. Okay.
No, I was going to say, I appreciate that analogy as somebody who does not have the experience that you have, to be able to add some reference point to when receiving a ticket and thinking about it in terms of more concrete items for myself, to say, we are conceptually working on we're working on the same project, but it's two different knowledges of this item. Do I have to fill in my knowledge gaps because this person's asking me to do X, and for me, X is entirely different than what they're asking for? And if I, it's change a derailleur on a bicycle, on a 10-year-old bicycle, change the spark plugs. There are gaps in my knowledge that I need to make sure I have to be more cognizant of going forward, just because there's two different perspectives there. So I appreciate the car analogy a bunch.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you going to say something, Ross?
Yeah, I was gonna bring it back actually to the piece of work that Erin wanted to work on, because as it seems like we were wrapping up that piece, and I was looking back at this and was going to try and tie it back in, but this ticket very much feels like what some people will refer to as a task, or a what to do without the why to do it. Almost
Yeah.
like, this person is this Ben, did you say, is the one that wrote this? Ben has an idea of, what he wants to do and why he wants to do it. And he was kind of delegating this task, which is okay, but it does very often lead to what you just experienced with doing the ticket the first time, which is maybe even slight misunderstandings or things like that can exacerbate and go into back and forth because you lack, a little bit of the why and possibly just context in general.
Yeah.
It feels like something that you could almost ask OpenAI to do this task, and it's not necessarily going to be right. It's like I very like this amount of change. I feel like it's something that you would ask, ChatGPT to do, and it's not going to be right because it doesn't have enough context, and you're going to have to go back and forth a couple of times. And that's almost exactly, what I'm picturing here, and with what's going on. It seems like, just reading this, we want to differentiate user types in this app by associating user with either adopter account or staff account. We need to add a third user foster account, but they wanted to rename something. So this is like a domain modeling name change. So something, naming happens in software engineering, and you want to improve names to describe the classes. And it seems like he's picked a name, and now he's trying to delegate just the name change throughout the app to better model the domain.
Ross, I appreciate you saying it in that context, because of it makes me think going forward, not this ticket, but as I continue to work through these issue tickets where I don't understand, it's a different relationship. I previously, when I worked at Planet Oregon, the applications that I were working on were well established and much larger applications. And this is a very new experience for me to be, in a version of a startup, an open source kind of startup. And you saying that makes me realize now that instead of going through this process of like having to rename things, it would be much more time saving for me to sit there and spend 25 minutes and go through this and maybe come up with 10 or 15 questions, maybe less, to say, why are these relationships important? Can I get a little bit more clarification? Can I get a video? Can I get some more context so that maybe I can sit there and come up with these sorts of changes before they've seen it, the powers that be see it in front of them and say, now we see the errors. I might, if I take that extra effort to ask a bunch of more questions to gain more context, that would help me in my process as I go through as I continue to do things for Ruby for Good.
Okay, before we get much deeper into the actual ticket, I want to as briefly as I can, just tie up the automotive analogy thing, because I think that part is actually, there's one more part I wanted to say that I think is important. So let's say someone gives a design change like the following. They say, right now we have this model of car, we'll call it model A, um, which I guess is actually a real name of a car that once existed. But we have model A, and the wheelbase is, I don't know how long a wheelbase is, 4 feet, let's say. Might be totally wrong. But all right, the existing design of this model A that's currently being manufactured is 4 feet. And now we want to make a version of this model A that has like a bigger back seat. And so we want the wheelbase to be 4 feet 6 inches, and we want some certain modifications made to the back seat, and the assignment lays out those modifications. And it might include, like there's some more like luxurious features in the back seat. There's like extra cup holders, or like the seats recline or something like that. Whatever the changes are, they're very spelled out. Um, and your only job as the person who designs the machinery that will manufacture this new model is to take those specifications and modify the existing machinery or make new machinery so that the factory can now manufacture both the regular Model A and this new trim level or whatever that has the longer wheelbase.
Yeah.
That is unfortunately not how most assignments come. They just say like, hey, we want like a more luxurious car with a bigger back seat.
Yeah.
And they're missing all the design specifications. So now it's expected that not only do you modify the manufacturing equipment to be able to manufacture this new variant, but you also have to design this new variant, which is a completely inappropriate thing to ask, for one, because maybe that's not your background and role and stuff like that. But then also it mixes two jobs.
Mm.
The mixing of those two jobs really multiplies the possibility of confusion and error and not doing the right thing and all that stuff. So I wanted to say that part to just drive that point home. Okay. Finally getting to this actual ticket. So I totally agree with what Ross said about this seems like a task because it's missing the why behind it. And to me, it seems actually even more important in an open source project like this for the design to be complete before it's made available to developers to take that ticket and implement it. So I think what we have here is just an incomplete assignment, and what needs to happen before any work can or should be done is for the assignment to be fleshed out to the appropriate degree.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I personally know Ben, and I'm kind of familiar with Ben's background and stuff like that. And so, again, obviously, I'm not blaming Ben, but maybe Ben doesn't have the background or experience to like know the things that I just described. So maybe, Erin, part of your role in this is that you
Yep.
can you can help, you can work with Ben to
Yep.
get this particular assignment more complete.
Yep.
Is it possible for you, Erin, to like right now scroll through the Slack history and kind of get a more complete idea of the context for this?
Not really. I'd have to
Not
go
really.
through, yeah, I'd have to go through last night's meeting notes. Like so where this sat at was short answer is probably not effectively. I could scroll through it. It would take a little bit too much time. I think this is the sort of thing that I could look through the notes and maybe take 15 to 20 minutes and come up with some solid questions to send to Ben, because I'd have to ask myself and sit here and say, what don't I know based on the notes of the meeting notes, and combine that into questions for the ticket. So I don't think I could effectively go through the Slack notes and say, here's what we need to get to.
Okay. And at the top of the call, I think you said you did take a swing at this one already.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, just curious, is that easy to pull up?
Yeah, let me bear with me 1 second here. Let's see. Nope. Hang on, let's do the PR.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do here. So this right here was last night's, not PR approved. There's still some sloppy code in here, but the files changed. We'll skip the gemlock right now. But last night's changes, let's see, we have the creation of the foster account, and then we have our relationships down here has one adopter foster profile. I have a question for you here.
Okay.
This as parent, one of the team leads said that parent is probably not the best choice of words for it. It seems a little too like a protected word that could be misconstrued. What are your thoughts about using as parent in this?
I think I'm not qualified to have an opinion.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to understand the domain a little more.
Okay. So here's, I don't know if this is useful to you in any way, but here are the changes that were made. If there's anything in particular you want to see, I can
Yeah.
stop
So
scrolling.
part of the reason why I was interested to see this
Yeah.
is to just kind of see the scope of the changes and get a feel for like how risky it seems.
Mm.
Um, and one thing that always feels risky to me is making, well, changes to the database schema are kind of like something I would categorize as risky.
Okay.
And I usually try not to make schema changes and code changes as part of the same change if I can help it, for the reason of risk mitigation. So if it's possible, and I realize it's not always possible, but if it is, and I try to always see if there's a way I can make it possible, is make a change to the schema that's backward compatible that can be deployed as its own unit of work.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's
That's
probably self-evident why, but that makes it so it's harder to make mistakes if you're doing such a small thing. And if anything goes wrong, it's easier to roll back. That kind of
Okay.
yeah, that I will second that and say that is a very good habit to get in early
Yeah.
because it's something that is absolutely necessary on large running production apps, is especially if you change and migrate the database and maybe create a new value, the migration can take a long time. And if
Yeah.
that migration takes a long time, you really want to separate it out so you get the field in the database and then can maybe run the migration and have all of the data available and have it be backwards compatible, where you don't need to worry about, hey, if we deploy an application logic change and it's wrong, you can roll back the application logic without worrying about the data. Uh,
If you could give
so
me a, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no. Were you just about to ask for an example?
Yeah, exactly. Please.
Yeah. I mean, the best, let's see, an easy example, just imagine, a social media app, Facebook or
Sure.
something like that, if it
Yep.
was written on Rails, and you wanted to add, let's say that you didn't have the attribute for their location,
Yep.
okay, but you had information in logs that you could infer their location. And so you
Okay.
were going to add on their profile a location, like you're going to add their location. So as a part of that ticket, you're responsible for adding the attribute location and populating the data and then creating the front end, right? And so there are going to be millions and millions of users. Your first step that you might want to fully deploy is literally just adding that attribute of location to the model because it's
Yep.
not being used anywhere in the app or
Yep.
anything. And so it's pretty safe. And so you can migrate the attribute. And then separately, you can then migrate the data into that attribute, whatever rake task or whatever you want to run that populates that location data also very safe to do because it's not being used on the front end. And then you have the data available and everything. You can do the application changes that may come out later and add that to a profile where it adds actually, the view of the location data. And that way it's very safe. If, a database table or row or things need to be locked, you can be a lot more careful about it when you're deploying it.
If it sounds to me that extending the idea of separation of concerns also can be applied to our releases into production applications as well. That sort of like separates each one of these issues. Also, with the idea of like, if something fails at a particular point, then I can be very specific about where my failure point is, and knowing that, okay, we made our change to the database, that worked just fine, but now we're at the front end portion of this. That's where our failure is. That separation there makes it way more fixable and maintainable than just like me pushing out all those changes and then saying, okay, this is good, send it out there, because it could be multi-layered, this error that I find in production.
Yeah, and I want to raise the point of why is separation of concerns good? It's because it makes each thing easier to think about. Something I emphasize a lot is I I don't follow good practices because I'm smart. I follow good practices because I'm stupid. Like the reason for doing all these things is to accommodate our frail and weak human brains.
Yep.
So like the reason we have HTML and CSS and JavaScript and Ruby and SQL, I mean, functionally they do different things, but uh, we could have all these things in one single file and it would still function. But the reason for keeping them in separate places is because it's easier to think about them when they're separated. And so doing this schema change separately from renaming files and stuff like that just makes it easier to think about. And there's kind of two things, I guess. There's like the scope of the change itself is easier to think about if it only deals with one thing. And then like time wise, it's easier if we do one thing and get that completely finished and we're like sure that that's correct and complete and all that stuff. Then we can stop thinking about it and then our entire mind is freed up to think about the next thing.
Yeah, that helps a lot with going forward. One of the things that I've been trying to do with Ruby for Good is, and not necessarily this ticket, this ticket kept on changing, but a previous ticket that had a front end and back end component to it, and it had Hotwire, and at the time that was all very new for me. I got done, and I was, to your point, it's too much, right? Like my brain is swirling over these different pieces coming together versus me getting into a better habit of it makes the more complex tasks seem more manageable if I start to break them down into these. Okay, I've completed this portion of it, regardless of what the ticket says. I have separated them out, and my success now will feel, it's just, to your point, it makes my dumb brain a little bit better if I follow these paths of smaller concerns as I go through things, regardless of the size of the ticket.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that would be my biggest piece of feedback on the PR and my biggest suggestion for I mean at this point, knowing the scope of the existing PR, if it were me doing this, I would start over and not necessarily redo the work, but like start over and maybe bring over small parts of the original
Yeah.
and do them separately.
Yeah. Cool. Appreciate it.
Okay. Let's see. We have 3 minutes left in the call, so I guess we probably can't do too much more. But anything else you wanted to talk about, ask, anything like that before we go?
Appreciate your time. That's about it for me. This was very useful, and no, I appreciate it. That's all. That's all I got.
Okay.
One,
Yeah, and I appreciate you
one
coming. Yeah,
small,
Ross, go ahead.
one small piece of advice, because it seems like you're going to have this conversation with Ben trying to get to know the app a little bit better. One piece of advice, because I've, onboarded a lot of Rails developers on apps, and I think the gem still works. There's a gem called Rails ERD that
Okay.
generates an entity relationship diagram for Rails models.
Yeah.
And I would try and use that on this app and then walk through to understand all of the models and what they do and the relationships, because especially at this size, that should encompass most of the logic on this app.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And side note, me and Ben actually have a I forget if the ball is in my court or his court, but we were supposed to get together sometime and do another one of these. So I'll follow up with him because that could be interesting to have a conversation with Ben and talk about it from that side of things. And maybe I could work with him so that we can make these tickets easier for people to digest, and I could help Ben slice up the tickets into pieces of work that are easy to work on and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that would be great. Not only I'm sure for Ben, but for someone like me too, so that as I'm going through this process myself, begin to, if I get larger scope tickets, be able to see someone else's process to be able to do that for myself also. Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
Okay. And a message from our sponsor. Um, this is very similar to a lot of the work I do for consulting. Um, I'm working with Currently, I'm working with like 3 different clients where we talk about this kind of thing. Um, it's like a lot of times my clients come to me with something very technical, but then we discover that what they mainly need help with is design and planning. Like, again, no offense, but this change was not really designed or planned very much. And so much time can be saved by taking some time up front and designing it before it's given to the developers. And I don't blame anybody for not doing that because it's a skill that nobody teaches you, and it takes a long time to learn. So I help people build those skills. Engineering leaders, I help them build the skills of taking an idea and thinking about what it would mean to implement that, not necessarily even from a technical perspective, but just like what even is this thing that we're trying to do, um, and then how do we slice that up into small achievable pieces and all that stuff so that we can take you know, the kind of standard way of operating is to have a vague idea and then take a swing at it, and it takes like 2 months, and at the end there's something that like kind of half works and nobody's happy with it. Instead of that, we can reduce it down to a fraction of that amount of time and actually end up with something good that's not buggy, that gets rolled out in a safe, smooth way and all that. Anyway, dear viewer, if you're interested in talking about that kind of service and how that might look, you can contact me at jason@codewithjason.com. Thanks everybody watching. Thanks guys for coming to the meetup, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.